Officially, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great honor to be involved with the World Food Safety Day celebrations. World Food Safety Day takes place on the 7th of June, which is on Sunday, but it's not really possible for all of us to have a good time together on Sunday, what with us hopefully enjoying a weekend. And so with the help of the Department of Health, we decided to rather put together a whole week of celebrations in order to ensure that we make a proper celebration of this year's World Food Safety Day. I think you can agree that our minds have been very, very focused on the pandemic at hand. And it feels good to be able to talk about something other than coronavirus, even if it is just for a couple of hours. As we're all consumers, I think we all appreciate the fact that we have a right to safe and nutritious food. But although we have food safety controls in place, the WHO tells us that almost 1 in 10 people in the world fall ill after eating contaminated food. And this has a devastating effect on livelihoods. It has an impact on children being unable to learn and adults being unable to work. Although we have a very strong regulatory framework, it's not just the regulatory aspects that make sure that our food is safe. And we rely on public-private partnerships in order to do that. And really that's what today is all about, because I'm going to be discussing a number of public-private partnerships and how these work to keep you and I safe as South Africans. Where does World Food Safety Day come from? Well, on the 20th of December 2018, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution proclaiming a World Food Safety Day. And this is only the second time ever that we've actually had this day celebrated. And in terms of this year's World Food Safety Day, the theme is Food Safety, Everyone's Business. And the WHO has put out 5 calls to action in order to help us to understand what this actually means. And yesterday, we were fortunate enough to work with the Department of Health and the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications, and we discussed the first call to action, which is ensuring it's safe. The second call to action is growing it safe. And this has really got to do with agriculture and food producers adopting good practices. And that's really the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speakers. As you can see, I have a whole panel of them today, and a good number of them are vets. And so we're going to be talking a lot about animal health. And then we have a very, very special guest all the way from Melbourne in Australia. That's it. And he has stayed up very late in order to chat to us about produce safety. And so we're going to be talking all things green with Mphane a little bit later in this presentation. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Our first presentation is by Dr. Mphane Molefe, and it's really great to be able to bridge the first call to action, which is government's role, and the second call to action, which is agriculture's role, by using this presentation. And so, Dr. Molefe, I really want to thank you so much for making yourself available to us this afternoon. It's really great that we have somebody from the Department of Agriculture who can assist us with this presentation. And it's so important to discuss veterinary public health, because I think we're all still, enjoying our steaks, but we need to make sure, obviously, that these are safe. And so over to you, Dr. Molefe. We would very much like to understand, how does the veterinary public health service ensure that food is safe for South Africans?
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson. So, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. My name is Mphane Molefe, and I am the Director responsible for veterinary public health in the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. And most of you may know it with a previous name that we call DAF, and now it's a name with a very long acronym, DLARRD. My presentation, I'm just going to try my best to stick within the 15 minutes allocated time. So I may skip a number of slides because I have a detailed presentation. But I'm just going to go through what our role is as veterinary services, in food safety. And I'm firstly with the historical background on what our role used to be in veterinary services. Way back, our role was mainly on control of major diseases, episodic diseases. So we were limited to just looking at on the animal health side. But over time, the scope has increased to include not only diseases, but also efficient production thereof to ensure that we follow the whole food chain. So over the years, the mandate has expanded. As you can see at the bottom, we are now working on a concept of farm to fork, whereby the role of veterinary services has gone beyond just primary animal health, but includes the whole food chain up to secondary production, but also at retail. We play some role at retail and also a big role in import and exports of animals and meat and all the other products. Just to look at the legislative mandate that we have in agriculture, we have several acts and regulations that govern the whole chain. Starting with at primary production is the Animal Diseases Act, Act 35 of 1984, which has a primary role to regulate on-farm disease control and the health of animals. And then after that, then you go to the next step, which is the products thereof, and the MidSafety Act then kicks in to regulate the slaughter of the animals and for human and animal consumption. I must emphasize, our role also extends to slaughter for animal consumption to ensure that only healthy animals are slaughtered, and also to regulate the importation and exportation of meat and meat products. But then in order to do that, there's a very important act that then ensures that there's traceability of the products, and we call it the Animal Identification Act. It ensures that every animal is identifiable at a farm level, and therefore you are able then to trace the product back to the farm of origin. And we are in a process to amend this piece of legislation to be able to identify individual animals, but that is a subject for another. The next legislation, which is very important, and previously we had not been giving serious attention to this, which is the Animals Protection Act. But this act has a mandate to ensure that animals are treated humanely. So the Animals Protection Act, its role is the prevention of cruelty to animals. So currently the emphasis is on producing meat that is safe, but animals thereof were treated in a humane way. And this is also an important role when it comes to export facilitation, where importing countries also require certification to ensure that the animals were treated in a humane way. So this is also an important piece of legislation. And then we also have the Agricultural Product Standard Act, which has a role to regulate the marketing, but also the quality of certain agricultural products. And then lastly, we have the Fertilizers, Farm Feed, Agricultural Remedies, and Stock Remedies Act. This long name, we just call it Act 36, for ease of reference. But then this is the act that then controls the inputs that go into primary production, which is fertilizers, farm feeds, agric remedies, and stock remedies, but also sterilizing plants that then handle waste or byproducts from abattoirs to make them into other products like pet food. Yes, then I just want to show here quickly the overview of MidSafety in a country to show from primary production when the animal is alive all the way until it gets to retail. So this is basically a short representation of the farm to fork concept, which then shows which regulatory activities responsible for what. You can see that agriculture and veterinary services plays a role at animal health, welfare, at primary production level under the Animal Diseases Act, Animals Protection Act, Animal Identification, and Act 36. So these acts are the ones that we use at primary production. And then at secondary production at abattoir level, we also play a role because under the MidSafety Act, we then regulate the slaughter of animals under the MidSafety Act, but also the Department of Health has a role at that point under Foodstuff, Cosmetics, and Disinfectants Act. So there's a bit of an overlap, but we are able to then be able to know whose mandate, is what, and we're able to work in harmony, within the two departments to ensure that there's food safety at the end of the day. And then we play some minimal role at retail level, especially to ensure that it's mainly a law enforcement role where we ensure that the meat that we find at butcheries or at restaurants and shops was sourced from an abattoir. So our role is not necessarily to enforce our laws at retail, but to make sure that the meat that is being consumed at that level or being sold at that level complies with the provisions of the MidSafety Act. And then finally, you have the acts, three acts that then cover the whole scope. The Stock Theft Act is very important in this whole chain, and NEMA, our National Environmental Management Act, also is very critical. And then there's a Consumer Protection Act, which then covers every aspect of the work that you do here. Thanks. Let's go to primary production and see what our role is. We are focused on detection, surveillance, prevention, treatment, and control of animal diseases to ensure that the animals are safe, but also looking at conditions of public health to, at the end of the day, safeguard public health. So we're not only safeguarding animal health, but we're also safeguarding public health by what we do at primary production. So we provide animal producers with information and advice on how to avoid, eliminate, and control food safety hazards. We run a residue monitoring and control program where we then take samples and check that the animals that end up being slaughtered do not have any residues that can harm human beings. And we also ensuring the responsible and prudent use of biological products, which especially antibiotics, because that is a critical aspect that we're trying to make sure that we don't end up with antimicrobial resistance. So that is our role, but there's also the role that I clarified earlier on to ensure that the animals are slaughtered humanely. Now, going to secondary production, that is at the abattoir level and processing plants. Our role at that level is to ensure that production facilities comply with prescribed food legislation, food safety legislation, but also to conduct inspections on live animals that have been brought from the farm. And we do ante-mortem inspection before an animal is slaughtered to be sure that the animal is then safe to be slaughtered. And thereafter, we then do primary and secondary meat inspection. And only meat that is safe and fit for human consumption will then be passed by our meat inspectors. And we also then make sure that these animals are treated humanely at the end of the day. We also have other roles that we play, as I mentioned earlier, under the MidSafety Act and also under the Animal Diseases Act. We do a lot of import facilitation. All the meat that comes into South Africa, that is imported into South Africa, has to be cleared by veterinary services at our ports of entry. And so we ensure that the meat that comes in complies with our food safety legislation through a veterinary health certification that would have been issued by the veterinarian on the other side, and then we check it and see whether that gives us all the attestations that we need. And if not, that meat will be rejected, or it may be treated in a different way, but it won't be sent through into commerce if we have doubts and if it doesn't comply with the South African food safety legislation. But we also then play a role in export facilitation, where we do, the opposite. When we are exporting meat and animal products, we then issue veterinary health certificates that then ensure and attest that the exported product or products meet both animal health and food safety requirements, so that the importing country will then be able to have satisfaction that the meat or the meat products are safe for human consumption. But we also then work in collaboration with other departments like Department of Health, NRCS, the DTI, and Consumer Commission in investigating foodborne illnesses. We then also set standards for laboratories involved in disease diagnostics. And finally, we also then raising awareness. So we do a lot of extension work with primary producers, with consumers, to ensure that the animals are treated properly and their food is safe for human consumption. Thank you very much. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Molefe. I had absolutely no idea there was quite so much legislation that has to do with anything that has got more than 2 legs. It is a very, very complicated area of food safety legislation within our country. So thank you very much for explaining it the way that you did so that we can understand it. How are you enjoying your new name as a department?
It's difficult. It's long. We don't know whether to call it DLARRD or DLARRD or DLARRD, whatever. We're still trying to figure out what to call it, but we'll get there.
You will get there. You will get there. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation, and we'll say goodbye for now, and we'll chat a little bit later. Thank you so much.